So how does a historical figure, who literally speaks 0 words in the entire Bible, a guy whose actual nickname translates to the ignored or the small, somehow become ancient history's ultimate symbol for absolute power?
It's quite the paradox, isn't it?
It really is. And welcome to today's deep dive into the source material, everyone. Today we're unpacking some truly fascinating excerpts from a document titled The 12 Apostles and Freemasonry, Chapter 10, James the Lesser.
Yeah, and this topic, it just feels so incredibly relevant right now.
Right, because we live in this culture that is just obsessively wired around standing out, right?
Yeah.
Like optimizing your personal brand, making sure everyone knows exactly what you're doing at all times.
Exactly. If you're not visible, you don't exist.
Exactly. But today, our mission is to explore this radical counter-narrative. We are looking at the profound ancient power of being completely intentionally invisible.
Which requires a massive paradigm shift. I mean, we are so socially conditioned to measure someone's impact by, the volume of their historical footprint or how much space they take up in a room.
Oh, for sure. The loudest person in the room is the boss, right?
Right. But the esoteric traditions we're looking at today, they flip that metric entirely upside down. They suggest that true power is actually found in the hidden foundation, the structures that hold everything else up, but, well, they never demand the spotlight.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to really understand how those esoteric secrets map onto James the Lesser, we have to establish just how aggressively invisible this guy is in the original historical record.
Oh, he's practically a ghost.
Literally a ghost. You dig into the biblical history, and he's identified as the son of Alphaeus, maybe the brother of Matthew, though the genealogy is a bit murky.
Very murky.
But the texts make a really deliberate point to separate him from the other men named James. I mean, he's totally distinct from James the Greater, the guy who was always in the spotlight with Peter and John.
Right. And he's not James the Just either, who was the prominent brother of Jesus.
Exactly. So this James gets tagged with the Greek title, ho micros.
Which basically translates to the less, or the small.
The small.
Yeah, and historians generally interpret that as meaning he was maybe younger or physically shorter or just, considerably less publicly known than the other guys.
But the crazy part is that across all the gospel accounts, he has absolutely no dialogue. None.
0 lines.
0 lines. There are no dramatic speeches. There are no epic miracles directly attributed to his hand. The source describes him beautifully here as a witness without proclamation.
Which is such a striking phrase.
It is. It's like, think about being an extra in this massive blockbuster film where you have no lines, you never get a close-up, but somehow you are the most critical person on the set.
And that immediately presents a historical problem, doesn't it?
How so?
Well, if a figure does nothing memorable and says absolutely nothing, standard human behavior dictates they just get written out of the story completely.
No, they just fade away.
Yeah, but tradition fiercely maintains his place in the apostolic lists. So it really forces us to ask, what function was his silence actually serving?
Well, let's challenge the premise of that silence for a second. Because if his life was so incredibly quiet, his death was, well, it was the exact opposite.
It's incredibly loud.
So loud. Tradition holds that he stayed in Jerusalem as this quiet, stabilizing leader, only to be brutally martyred. They threw him from the pinnacle of the temple and then beat him to death with Fuller's Club.
Yeah, it's a violently abrupt end for a life defined by such complete silence.
It really is. So how do these esoteric traditions reconcile that?
What's fascinating here is that the esoteric traditions look at that violent contrast, and they don't see his biblical silence as, like, a lack of personality or some absence of character.
Okay.
They view it as a deliberate, cultivated presence. His function in the historical narrative isn't demonstrated by speaking, it's demonstrated entirely by being. He's a fixed point.
And there's this incredible visual illustration provided in our source material that synthesizes this perfectly. It depicts James holding that very club of his martyrdom, this heavy, blunt instrument of his death. But his posture is entirely serene, and resting right on his chest, placed directly over his heart, is the Masonic square and compasses featuring the letter G.
Yeah, it's a very powerful image.
It physically bridges the trauma
Right.
of his historical silence with this hidden initiatory knowledge.
And the symbolism there is just incredibly dense. I mean, the club represents the brutal, unforgiving reality of the material world, right? The ultimate physical sacrifice.
Yeah.
But placing the square and compasses over his heart, that indicates that his silence wasn't empty. It was the active sheltering of intellectual and spiritual architecture.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Taking that idea of spiritual architecture, we move from the literal historical silence of James into how ancient mystical systems translated that exact silence into a cosmic superpower.
A cosmic mechanic, really.
Yeah. The text introduces this ancient mystical maxim: to know, to dare, to will, and to keep silent. And what stands out to me is that keeping silent isn't framed as the starting point. It's not like shut your mouth and listen to learn.
No, no, it's the absolute final stage of maturation.
Wow.
It is the culmination of the path, because those first three actions, knowing, daring, and willing, those are mechanisms for generating and directing immense power, right? Spiritual or personal power.
Right.
But power without a container is just an explosion. Silence is the container.
Oh, that's a great way to put it. And the source connects this directly to Kabbalah, specifically mapping James the Lesser onto the Tree of Life. He aligns with Yesod, which translates to the foundation.
Yes, the ninth sephira on the tree.
Right, and the function of Yesod is so fascinating. It acts as the subconscious reservoir. It gathers all these massive, raw, chaotic energies from the higher Sephiroth above it, and it acts as a funnel, quietly transmitting them down into the material world, into Malkuth.
And without Yesod, the physical world would literally shatter.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
Shatter?
Yeah, because the higher Sephiroth represent pure, unmanifested potential divine justice, infinite mercy, raw creation. If that pure voltage hits the material plane directly, it's completely destructive.
Oh, so it needs a buffer.
Exactly. Yesod acts as the necessary step-down transformer. It takes the infinite and translates it into something the finite world can actually survive and utilize.
So to ground this for everyone listening, think about Yesod and James the Lesser as like the electrical wiring or the plumbing inside the walls of your house.
That's a perfect analogy.
Right, you never look at it. You certainly don't invite your friends over to be like, hey, come admire my copper pipes.
Unless you're a plumber, maybe.
Fair point. But if that hidden infrastructure fails, the entire house shuts down. The beautiful lighting, the climate control, the appliances, it all becomes instantly useless without the invisible network holding the current.
And that really answers the question of whether keeping silent in these mystical traditions is just some elitist way to hoard secrets.
Yeah. Is it? Because that's a common critique.
It's a very common critique, but it's not true. It isn't about hiding knowledge just for the sake of exclusivity. Silence is a structural necessity. It actively shelters the word.
Because if you have high voltage energy, the wire has to be insulated.
Precisely. If the wire isn't hidden and protected, it causes a fire. James represents the insulation.
Wow. But, you know, filtering that massive cosmic energy isn't just an abstract universal mechanic. It actually plays out on a microscopic level inside our own human psychology, which brings us directly to alchemy and the internal landscape.
Right, the macrocosm reflecting the microcosm. The esoteric traditions always demand that you apply these universal laws to the individual soul.
And we see this reflected in mystical theology. The source references St. John of the Cross and the cloud of unknowing, which argue that the deepest, most permanent spiritual transformations, they can only happen in complete darkness.
Yeah, James is described as the builder of the interior temple.
But the alchemical connection is what truly anchors this for me. In alchemy, James represents the phase of coagulation.
And coagulation is, well, it's arguably the most difficult phase for the human ego to actually endure.
Why is that?
Because the earlier stages of alchemy, like calcination, which burns away the old self, they're dramatic. They involve these profound, sudden flashes of insight or enlightenment. It's exciting, you know.
That's the fireworks. But the source defines coagulation as the entirely unglamorous integration of opposites into a stable form after that initial flash of enlightenment has faded.
Right, after the fireworks are over.
Exactly. I want to challenge everyone listening to think about this in the context of your own life. Compare the alchemical coagulation phase to, say, a long-term relationship or building a career from the ground up. You have the honeymoon phase, right?
Yeah, the launch day.
The launch day. That's the flashy enlightenment. It's highly visible. Everybody's cheering. The adrenaline is pumping.
The alchemical fire is burning really bright.
But the coagulation phase, that is waking up at 5 a.m. on a rainy Tuesday, 5 years later.
Doing the dishes.
Doing the dishes. Doing the quiet, repetitive, utterly unglamorous work of building permanence. It's the conscious choice to stay and build the structure long after the dopamine and the adrenaline are completely gone.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this psychological reality aligns perfectly with the astrological associations provided in the text. James the Lesser is paired with the sign of Cancer, which is ruled by the moon.
Okay, the moon.
Yeah. And Cancer governs intuition, deep memory, and this protective devotion.
So he's like the archetype of the cosmic nurturer.
Exactly. He guards the tradition. He performs his structural duties not for recognition, but out of a profound emotional fidelity to the work itself.
Wow.
I mean, think about what it takes to nurture a fragile truth in complete darkness without ever demanding that the sun shine on you as a reward for doing it.
It requires an insane level of emotional maturity.
A level that simply doesn't require an audience.
So what does this all mean when we bring it down to earth? If we take these high-level cosmic and alchemical concepts and actually drop them into a physical, human organization, you start to see exactly why Freemasonry built rituals entirely around this James the Lesser archetype.
Yes.
Like, how do you institutionalize invisibility?
Well, they ritualize it by making the invisible structures of power visible to the initiate. They basically force the initiate to recognize the hidden labor that sustains their reality.
Right, and the source explores this concept of the silent stone. This is the Mason whose labor is entirely unseen, but absolutely indispensable.
Yeah, the text lists a few roles, like the Tyler, the officer who guards the door outside the lodge room.
Or the secretary who's just quietly recording the minutes while everyone else is having these loud debates.
Yeah.
Or even the brother who simply shows up 2 hours early to set up the chairs and stays late to sweep the floors.
And let's look at the psychological mechanism of those roles, particularly the Tyler. The Tyler literally sits outside the closed door with a drawn sword to protect the gathering.
He's not even in the room.
He doesn't even get to witness the ritual he is protecting. By physically submitting to a role where you cannot be praised, where you are literally excluded from the applause inside the room, you actively starve the ego.
Oh, that's powerful. So sweeping the floor isn't just a chore.
No, it is the physical prerequisite for alchemical coagulation. You cannot build the inner temple while your ego is constantly feeding on external validation.
And that dynamic is elevated even further in the Royal Arch degree, which focuses intensely on the keystone.
Ah, yes, the keystone.
It sits at the very top, but perfectly beneath the archway, holds the entire curve together.
And it's a fascinating architectural and spiritual metaphor. It's the only stone in the structure whose entire existence is defined by bearing, crushing, opposing forces.
Right.
Its relative invisibility is simply a byproduct of its massive utility.
The source also references the point within the circle, which is this symbol of absolute centeredness and inner stillness amidst a whirlwind of cosmic activity.
Flanked by the parallel lines of St. John the Baptist and St. John the Evangelist.
Right. But the most mind-bending concept to introduce here, the one that I think really challenges human nature, is the Kabbalistic idea of Tzimtzum.
Tzimtzum, yes. That comes from Lurianic Kabbalah. It addresses a fundamental theological paradox. If God is infinite and fills all things, how can anything that is not God exist?
Because there's no room.
Exactly. And the answer is Tzimtzum, which means self-contraction.
So the infinite must actively shrink itself to create a void.
Yeah.
Right? A space where the finite world can actually exist. And James models this contracted presence.
He does.
But I have to push back on Tzimtzum for a second, because everything about our human nature fights against this completely.
Oh, 100%.
I mean, it is one thing to willingly do the quiet labor in the quarry, sweeping floors, taking notes. We can all conceptualize and appreciate a hard worker.
Sure.
But actively shrinking yourself, contracting your own ego and your own intellect and your own presence just to make space for someone else to grow, that goes against every biological survival instinct we possess.
Well, absolutely does.
We're evolutionarily wired to expand, to take up space, to shout our accomplishments so we don't get eaten or forgotten by the tribe. So how on earth is actively shrinking a position of power?
Because it is the ultimate demonstration of mastery over that exact biological programming. Think about it. If you are a leader and you take up all the oxygen in the room with your brilliance, your team cannot exist. They just become an extension of your ego.
Wow.
True strength is the ability to bear the tension of leadership without consuming the space. If the keystone decides it wants to be admired, if it shifts even an inch out of place to catch the light so people notice it, the entire arch collapses.
Because it moved.
Exactly. The self-contraction of Tzimtzum is the realization that maintaining the space for the structure to thrive is infinitely more important than being recognized as the creator of that space.
If the keystone demands validation, the building falls. That is a heavy, sobering reality.
Very much so.
And it brings all of these esoteric, Masonic, and biblical threads completely out of the abstract and drops them right onto our doorsteps today.
The source distills this journey into 3 crucial teachings for the initiate.
This is where the ancient architecture becomes a daily practice. Yes. So the first teaching is that sacred work is often invisible. Greatness is measured by consistency and endurance, not visibility. The deepest roots of a tree are the ones you will never, ever see.
And they hold the whole thing up.
Exactly. The second teaching is that silence is a form of power. Keeping silent is active mastery. The text uses an incredible phrase here. It says, the goal is to learn to carry light without leaking it.
To carry light without leaking it, I mean, that requires immense internal pressure.
Right. And I want to ask you listening to this right now, in an era of endless social media updates, where we are culturally pressured to broadcast every single thought, every workout, every minor career achievement, how often are you leaking your light just to get noticed?
That's a profound question.
Every time we post an internal victory for public likes, we are venting the internal pressure that could have been used for actual alchemical transformation. We're bleeding out our energy because we're addicted to the cheap dopamine of the crowd's validation.
We trade permanent internal transformation for temporary external applause. And the source material reminds us that when you leach your light, you lose the heat necessary for coagulation.
And which leads perfectly into the third and final teaching. Know your place in the structure. Not every stone is meant to be a capstone. Finding absolute peace in your role as a deep earth foundation stone is what leads to actual inner freedom.
And that's so hard today because our modern structures, our corporate ladders, our social hierarchies, they are obsessed with producing capstones. Everyone wants to be at the peak.
Yep.
But when you accept your role as a foundation stone, a profound psychological shift happens. You are no longer enslaved by the opinions of the people walking on the floor above you.
That's so true.
You achieve a quiet, unshakable inner freedom that the highly visible capstone who is constantly exposed to the wind, the elements, and public scrutiny will never be able to experience.
Wow. We've covered a massive amount of conceptual ground today. We started with James the Lesser, this biblical extra defined by his lack of dialogue and a brutal martyrdom.
We watched ancient Kabbalists transform that historical silence into Yesod.
Right, the hidden plumbing of the cosmic tree of life. And we explored the difficult alchemical reality of coagulation, that quiet, unglamorous, Tuesday morning work of making a transformation permanent.
And we saw how Freemasonry actively ritualizes this truth through the Tyler guarding the door, the keystone bearing the crushing weight, and the awe-inspiring mechanism of Zimsum.
The supreme strength required to contract your own ego so that something greater can exist in the space you leave behind. It really is a profound journey from complete obscurity to absolute foundational power.
It really is.
But as we wrap up this deep dive into the source material, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. The text asks you to consider what hidden aspects serve as your own foundational supports. But let's push the metaphor all the way to its breaking point.
Let's see what happens to the architecture.
Exactly. If the strength of an arch depends entirely on the hidden keystone, bearing the tension in complete silence, what happens to a society or a workplace or even a family unit when it completely stops valuing its lesser hidden pillars? If everyone demands to be the visible, celebrated capstone, if every single stone in the building is fighting for the spotlight and refusing to bear the quiet weight, does the entire structure of our culture risk collapsing under the sheer mass of its own collective ego?
I mean, a structure composed entirely of capstones isn't a building at all. It's just a pile of rocks on the ground.
We started out by talking about blockbuster movies and how human nature wires us to give all the glory to the loudest people in the room. But maybe the real heroes of history aren't the ones delivering the dramatic speeches to the roaring crowds.
Maybe not.
Maybe the most vital, untouchable power belongs to the invisible floor holding the entire theater up. So embrace your inner James the Lesser this week. Find your power in the quiet, unglamorous work of holding your world together. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.